Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and we're going to go ahead and hop into our first unit of a brand new topic today, okay? So we're leaving macromolecules from last week. We're getting into something a little bit different. We're going back to that cell membrane y'all might remember us talking about in our first unit, and we're also going to be talking about transport. Well, do you know what transport means? To transport something means to move it around. So what we're really focusing on in this unit is how do things move across the cell membrane, okay? We're going to start off nice and easy today talking about something known as diffusion, okay? You know what diffusion is. Let me show you a picture of it and we'll kind of talk through it a little bit. Okay, so take a look at this picture. Imagine you have a cup of water and you're dropping a little bit of food coloring into that cup. Okay, at first the dye is going to be all concentrated right there where that, the liquid hit, right? But after a couple minutes, if you kind of kept your eye on it, that dye would start to spread out throughout the water, okay? Well, if you've ever seen that happen, you saw diffusion, okay? And I just wanted to take a second and talk about what's really going on here, okay? So we all know when you put food coloring into that water, it's going to start to spread out. That's kind of what diffusion is. It's just the spreading out of those molecules. Well, have you ever stopped to think why that dye is moving around in the water? Well, this is something that a really smart guy named Einstein actually figured out. So what's going on here is that inside of this cup of water, there's these water molecules, and they're actually moving around. They're going all over the place. We can't see it, but they are moving around. And what happens is when those water molecules are moving around, they're just kind of moving randomly, that kind of stirs up the dye. And so when you first drop that food coloring in there, it's all concentrated, but after a minute, those water molecules are going to kind of mix it up and mix it around, okay? I did want to take a brief second and talk about what could make this diffusion happen slower or faster. So first of all, if these water molecules are warm, the warmer they are, the faster they're moving around. And so if you drop that food coloring into some warm water, it's going to diffuse quicker than if you were to drop it into some cold water, okay? The amount of dye that you use is also going to have an impact on it, right? If you put in a lot of food coloring, it's going to spread out faster than if you just put a couple of drops in there. And then finally, the area or how much solute, how much water there is also going to kind of determine that too. Okay, so let's break this down. I've got some vocabulary terms we need to know about before we really hop into anything else, okay? So you're going to hear this term a lot today. Concentration gradient. Okay, what is a concentration gradient? Well, let's break it down using some of these words here, okay? So concentration, when I say the word concentration, what I'm talking about is the amount of solute in a solution. Now, I know I've already lost a couple, y'all, so let's break those words down too. Okay, so we have the amount of solutes in the solution. Well, what is a solution? Let's talk about salt water, okay? Salt water is an example of a solution. A solution is any mixture that is homogeneous, which means if you're looking at a cup of salt water, if it's dissolved the right way, you won't really be able to see the salt in the salt water. It'll be totally dissolved into the water. So that's called a solution, is any mixture that is homogeneous, okay? So if the salt water is the solution, then we can break that solution down into two parts. So the solvent is going to be water. Anytime you see a solution and there's water in there, water is always the solvent. In fact, they call it the universal solvent because water can basically break down anything, okay? There's just a very few exceptions to that rule, okay? And then if we're talking about salt water, in this example, the salt would be the solute. The solute is whatever goes into the water and is being dissolved, okay? These words over here kind of all sound alike. There's a lot of S words and they kind of sound similar. So I just wanted to give you a hint. This is how I remembered it when I was in high school, and it helped me kind of remember the difference in between them, okay? So when we're talking about a solvent and a solute, first of all, remember that water, if there's water, that's the solvent, okay? But here's how I remember the solute part of it. I would imagine someone walking up to a diving board, jumping up a couple of times, and then right before they dove into the water, they would give a salute. and the word solute kind of sounds like the word solute, and to me, that always helped me remember which one was which. Whichever one is going into the water is the solute, and water, if there is water, is always going to be the solvent. Okay, so now that we got those words figured out, let's take a look at some of these other words. Okay, so when we use the word high concentration means that there's a lot of solute in that area, right? So in our previous example, when you drop that food coloring into the water, where the drop of food coloring is, that would be the high concentration, and then the low concentration is when there's a small amount of solute, okay? And most of the time, we're always going to move from high to low concentration, okay? And this is known as the concentration gradient. So the concentration gradient is the difference in the amount of solute between two parts of a solution. So let's take another look at a picture and kind of break it down a little bit. Okay, so take a look at my example of this beaker over here. Okay, this is very similar to what we were looking at in that first slide. Okay, so what's going on here is the water, again, is the solvent, and we're dropping food coloring in there, so that would be the solute. Okay, in this area where you first drop, far on the left over there, where you first drop the dye into the beaker, that would be the area of high concentration. This is high concentration. But over here where there is no dye, towards the bottom of the beaker, that would be the low concentration. Okay, so as the water molecules are moving around, they're kind of mixing that dye up with it, and so the dye moves from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. It kind of spreads out, right? So that's basically what diffusion is. So what we want to remember here is that diffusion always goes from high to low concentration. Okay, it spreads out from where there's a lot of it to where there's just a little bit of it. Some different examples of diffusion could be dye in water, but also things like perfume or cologne. Smells diffuse a lot. So imagine you're in your house and you're playing video games in your room, but then you get that whiff of whatever your parents are cooking. Maybe they've just put some cookies in the oven or they're making dinner, right? Well, that smell is originating from the kitchen, but it has diffused across the house, and now you're able to smell it even where the food's not. So that would be another example of diffusion, okay? Remember that the high concentration is where the molecules are tightly packed together. So up here where you first drop the dye, that's the high concentration. And with diffusion, we always move from high to low concentration. And so the low concentration is where the molecules are going to start to spread to, okay, where there's no dye, okay? Great. So that is diffusion. Okay, I wanted to break this down a little bit more for you. So diffusion, let's remember that that is always moving from high to low concentration. Here's basically an example of what's going on at the, a molecular level, a smaller level. So what's going on here is, the reason we're talking about diffusion is that this is how we get things in and out of your cells. Oxygen, other things you need, carbon dioxide, they're going to diffuse across that membrane, okay? So over here we got a lot of the solutes, the molecules of dye. They're going to diffuse across the membrane here. You can see they're kind of spreading out, okay, until we eventually reach an equilibrium. What does equilibrium mean? Does it kind of sound like a word you know of? Kind of sounds like the word equal a little bit, right? And so in equilibrium, if you were to count all these up, where we started with a lot on the left and not very much on the right, over here in this last picture, this is an equilibrium. We have 10 molecules of dye on each side. So we've reached equilibrium. Now, I wanted to pause here and talk about a misconception. Sometimes people see, oh, well, we're even now. We're in equilibrium. It's 10 and 10. So everything stops and we're all good to go. That's not really the case. What this really is called is dynamic equilibrium. And what's happening is the dye is still moving around, but the net overall is going to stay the same. So once we get here, it's not like everything pauses. Okay, that dye is still moving around, it's still moving across the membrane, but we're going to be left with an equal amount at the end of everything, 10 and 10, okay? So this is dynamic equilibrium. They're still moving around, but there's not really going to be much of a change at that point. Great. All right, y'all, let's keep it going. Let's see what I got next. So I got a couple of pictures here I wanted to look at. In the bottom left picture, you can kind of see how diffusion is happening. So we're starting with an area. I'm going to back up and go to it again just so y'all can see what I'm talking about. So in this picture right here, we're starting with a lot of molecules kind of packed together, but they spread out, right? So that's diffusion, going from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Here's another kind of vocabulary word I want you to know is passive transport. Okay, there's different types of transport. Some of them take energy to perform, and some of them don't take any energy to perform. If it's passive transport, that means there's no energy input. This is just kind of happening without any effort on our part. Okay, so no energy is needed in active transport. And the reason for that is that we're going from high concentration to low concentration. So when we use these words, high and low concentration, I kind of want you to think of it like riding a bicycle up and down a hill. Okay, so imagine you're starting here on your bicycle and you're riding down the hill. You're starting from an area of high area and you're going to move to the area of low. Well, that's not really going to take that much energy, right? It's pretty easy to ride your bicycle down a hill. Now, the opposite is where it gets hard. If you're trying to go from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration, it's a lot like riding your bicycle up a hill. That takes a lot of energy. So just remember that. That'll come up later in this unit. So just kind of keep that in your mind as we're talking about this stuff. So diffusion, we always go from high to low, and that's why it doesn't require any energy. It's just like riding a bicycle up and down a hill. Okay? So again, the goal of this diffusion is that we're trying to reach something called equilibrium, and sometimes you'll even hear it called dynamic equilibrium. What does dynamic mean? Dynamic means they're moving around a lot and there's still a lot of action going on. Y'all, I don't know if y'all remember this, but the dynamic duo is Batman and Robin. They're like superheroes, right? And so their nickname, they work together, were the dynamic duo. They're always out there fighting off crime, right? And so dynamic equilibrium, we're still left with a total overall net. The overall is not really changing, but they're still moving around. And let's kind of look at this picture and I'll kind of break it down a little bit. Okay, so in this picture that we're looking at, we're starting with a beaker, and all of the solutes are on the left side. Those are the red dots, okay? So all the red dots are on the left side. In the middle, those solutes are kind of evening out, right? Some of the ones on the left are moving over there to the right. And then that last picture, we have reached something called dynamic equilibrium. Now the concentration of particles are equal on both sides, but that doesn't mean everything stops. It's dynamic equilibrium. The solutes are still moving back and forth, but the overall is going to stay the same. Okay, so that's kind of what we're trying to get to here, is that dynamic equilibrium. All right, y'all, I know that gave you no problem at all, but just in case someone's a little bit confused, we're going to go ahead and review this together to make sure everybody's on the same page. Okay, so let's read over the directions and we'll go ahead and get started on this and see what y'all came up with. Okay, so for each of these, what we're going to do is draw some arrows, and the arrows are supposed to show which way the diffusion is happening. Now, something that I want us to remember is that diffusion's actually going on both ways, okay? The solutes are moving in and they're moving out, but they're moving in one direction more than the other. So for each of these, what I'm going to do is draw two arrows. I'm going to draw a big arrow and a little arrow. The big arrow shows us the net overall change, and then the little arrow is just there to remind us that they are moving in both directions. There's just going to be a bigger difference in one direction of those two, okay? So let's go ahead and look at these. Okay, so letter A, remember that with diffusion, we always move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Where are there more solutes in letter A? They're mostly inside of the box, right? And so that means overall, there's going to be a lot more solutes moving out, okay? They're going to be moving out. So I'm going to draw this big arrow so that we know overall, most of the solutes are moving out. But a little bit of them are going to move in. Once we hit that dynamic equilibrium, they're going to move out to begin with, but then once they hit that equilibrium, they just kind of rotate in and out in that balanced state. Great, let's look at letter B. So same thing here, diffusion, and we're moving from high concentration to low concentration. Where is there more solute? There's more solute outside of the box than there is inside. So overall, most of our diffusion is going to be going into the cell, or into this little box. So I'm drawing that arrow nice and big, okay? But let's draw a little arrow going out, because some of them are going to go out. Once we reach that dynamic equilibrium, they kind of rotate in and out in that balanced state. Okay, now let's go to the next one. This one's a little bit different. It's giving us the percent solution versus those little circles to represent the solutes, okay? So 4% sugar solution to 1% on the outside, okay? So we're going from high to low concentration. So overall, the net biggest difference here is going to be moving out of the cell, right? Okay? That's the biggest change. And then once we reach that dynamic equilibrium, there will be some going into, okay? Great job. Let's look at the last one here. So this says there's a 2% sugar solution inside and a 5% sugar solution on the outside. We're going to move from high to low. So that means that there's going to be a lot more going into the cell. So that's going to be my big arrow. But there will be a little bit moving out, right? So that just is kind of supposed to show us how this diffusion is taking place. We always move from high to low concentration, so they're kind of trying to spread out more evenly, okay? Let's go to the next slide and see what y'all came up with. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at these. So 2 is just asking us to fill in the blanks here. A, does a cell expend energy when it diffuses molecules in or out of it? So are we using energy for diffusion? I'll give you a hint. Diffusion is a form of passive transport. In passive transport, we do not. No energy is used for diffusion or any type of passive transport. All right, B, name 2 types of diffusion. Okay, so the one we've been talking about today is known as simple diffusion. So we'll go ahead and write that down. Another one we'll talk about later in this unit, I haven't really mentioned it today, is called facilitated. Okay, facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is just like simple diffusion. You move from high to low concentration. If you know what the word facilitate means to help. And so what's happening in facilitated diffusion is they're just moving through, instead of moving through the membrane, they're moving through a protein in the middle of the membrane. So facilitated diffusion is just like simple diffusion. There's just a protein involved. But just like simple diffusion, there's no energy required here. Okay? Let's look at the next one, number 3. Fill in the blanks to complete the sentences. Diffusion is a type of simple transport. You might remember me saying that just a second ago. Diffusion is a type of simple transport. Okay? B, diffusion continues until the concentration of molecules become equal throughout the region. And I would say this says diffusion continues until, I would say that diffusion is still going on. Once we hit that dynamic equilibrium, they're still moving around, there's just no net change. Okay, so that diffusion is kind of always happening, right? Okay, the next one, it wants us to come up with a couple of things that are going to affect the rate of diffusion. So let's go back to our food coloring in the water again. What are a couple of things that would make that diffusion happen at a different rate? Well, I mentioned temperature is a big one. Okay, so the temperature is going to affect it. If it's really hot, it's going to diffuse a lot quicker than if it was really cold. Okay, some other things we could put here would be the distance it has to travel. So like think of our dye in a cup of water. That diffusion is going to be a lot quicker inside of a cup of water than like a whole pool of water, right? If you drop just one food coloring into that pool, it would take a long time for it to spread out across that huge area, okay? So what are some other things that can affect the rate of diffusion here, okay? Well, I want to put concentration gradient, concentration gradient, kind of a small line to write this on. Okay? So when the concentration gradient is more steep, that diffusion is going to happen a little bit quicker. And then the last one we're going to write here is surface area. And surface area is specifically dealing with cells. If a cell is really, really large, it has more surface area, and therefore things can diffuse into it quicker. A tiny cell is not going to have as much surface area, so it's going to be slower to get things into there. Okay, last one, y'all. Let's see what we got. The movement of the particles is blank, and the cells do not require energy to move these particles. Okay, the movement of the particles is random. Okay, so remember me talking about the water moving around in that cup of water. They just kind of, the water molecules are moving around randomly. We're not dictating where it's going. It's just a random thing that's going on, and that's what's really mixing up all of that dye into the water, okay? Y'all, thank y'all so much for following along with me. That was really great. I hope you learned something. Your teacher has some other work for you to practice this stuff on, so make sure to give it your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.